Good afternoon and welcome to Google in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Today we're joined by John Palfrey, who's with us to discuss his latest book, BiblioTech, Why Libraries Matter More Than Ever in the Age of Google. In BiblioTech, Palfrey investigates the purpose and future of libraries when information is broadly available on the internet. In addition to BiblioTech, Palfrey is the author of several books, including Born Digital and Interop. He's the head of school at Phillips Andover Academy. Previously at Harvard, he led the effort to reorganize the Harvard Law School Library, and he is the founding member of the Digital Public Library of America. Please join me in welcoming John Palfrey.
Thank you all for making time on this busy day, and Brendan, thank you for organizing this and for inviting me here to Google in Cambridge. I am thrilled to have a chance to talk about this new book called BiblioTech. Its subtitle, in fact, is Why Libraries Matter More Than Ever in the Age of Google, so I feel it's fitting to be making this particular argument here at Google, and since it came out just 2 days ago, I'm thrilled to be doing it right here for the first sort of official book talk with all of you. And I hope that, especially if I say anything that's inappropriate or provocative about what you're up to, that you will push back and ask lots of questions in the conversational part. On some level, this book is really a love letter to libraries and to librarians. It's an argument that says that we need these institutions more than ever at this moment in our history, not despite what all of you are doing at Google, but in part because of it, and to try to make the argument that both physical libraries as well as digital forms of libraries are crucial to our democracy. That's the entire argument right there. I am not bearing the lead, just putting it out there, and I will then try to make that argument in the course of the next 20 or so minutes. The inspiration, in a way, for this book was I worked down the street at Harvard Law School for a long time and was the director of its library, the law library, which is, in many respects, the largest and biggest law library in the world. And one of the items in the collection is this image. I doubt you'll be able to guess what it is, but it's the personal library of Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr., who was on the Supreme Court. He was also a professor at our law school. And this picture actually depicts his library, his personal library in Washington, D.C., when he was on the United States Supreme Court. And often I think about this particular picture because it seems like such a lovely place to sit and think and to do your work. But of course, it's also perhaps anachronistic, particularly with kids who are growing up in this particular age. I work now at a boarding school, Andover. I'm grateful to have a few of our fine graduates here and Google staff members as well. And if you think about the kids.
Fellow Exeter graduates.
Oh my gosh, all right, fellow Exeter graduates too. We're a purple room between the red and the blue. But if you think about the kids who are educating today, and I also have small kids, you can imagine that this particular vision of what a room might be like with all of these books around it might not be exactly what they have in mind as a space to work. When I worked at the Harvard Law School library, we had a room, beautiful reading room, and it was full almost all the time with kids kind of elbow to elbow. And as they were working in there, they were almost always doing what some of you are doing, which they had a laptop, they had a water or a coffee or something, but almost never did they do something like this, to actually pull a book down off the shelves. They were actually in the space, I think, to be with one another in a social space, and they wanted to be in the library, they wanted the reference librarians and so forth, but the act was not doing this. They weren't walking around to the shelves and pulling something off. So the thought experiment, in a way, is what's a version of this thoughtful space that we will create for kids who are growing up now, even if they don't necessarily associate this kind of a library with the way in which they want to be connecting with ideas. Now, I suspect that many people will continue to build libraries like this one, but it'll almost be books as furniture or collectible items or something that are there as tangible items as opposed to the references they will get to. But I think it's very important that we actually come up with an affirmative version of what we think would be a great space for learning and for studying. I would also note the importance of the physical library and the continuing importance of that. Because we're here in Cambridge, I've got a picture up of the Boston Public Library. So the history of libraries, I think, is a very important piece of the story. In 1852, a philanthropist named Joshua Bates agreed to give $50,000 in the city of Boston to create the first big public library, actually, in the world. And the idea of having a space where anybody in the city can come free to all to get access to information or knowledge seemed radical at the time, even though now it seems completely obvious. But it actually started here in Boston in a really meaningful way. And I think the most important part of this image is the notion of free to all, the idea that anybody can get access to information at any time without anybody else making that choice for us. I think that's a cornerstone piece of democracy. And just like that reading room that I showed from Holmes, what will the physical library be like in a digital era? I think it goes without saying that part of the backdrop here is the notion of knowledge moving to the cloud. The idea that the vast majority of time, instead of going like this to pull down a book, kids go like this and pull something up, ordinarily going on their Android device right to their Google browser and typing it in and finding the information that has been stored up here. And this is one of the ways in which the book, I think, is in a sense, although not directly, it's concerned with the notion that the people who are holding the information are in the private sector. And that includes you guys and includes lots of others who are the holders of information when it's in the cloud-based environment. There isn't really a public option when it comes to the cloud at the moment, at least not one that is in a significant player in the field. And actually that is one, I think, of the arguments, which is to think about how do we ensure that there is a public option in addition to the private spaces that are developing online. I think it becomes most acute in the context of books. Over the last several years, librarians have been fretting greatly about the future of their ability to be libraries in that classic way that the Boston Public Library and other places have been. Why? In part because as knowledge moves to the cloud, and to the extent that people continue to prefer ebooks or electronic forms of things over the analog forms of things, it actually becomes trickier for libraries to do what they have done traditionally. I'd just be curious, actually, because I'm doing this at each of the talks, how many people prefer to read a physical form of a book like this in this room? A little more than half. How many people prefer a digital book? How many people are really agnostic? You're happy to read either, which includes me. Okay, so that's probably most prefer this. Yes, sir. Another option?
I'll point out that the other option,
yes,
mine is would love to read it in paper,
yeah,
don't want to carry the paper.
Awesome. And so therefore you download it to a Kindle or some other device, whatever it might be, iBooks. Who knows?
Android phone.
Android phone. Oh, right. Excellent. Excellent. What is the
The other issue is just poor functionality on many existing ebooks. They've been badly transformed to the wrong form.
Right. I don't think we have yet, anybody has really cracked that code particularly, nor made it, frankly, more useful. One of the interesting things is actually, in the context of law school, these unbelievably expensive books, $150 books that kids use still for their case books, that are they're full of cases, basically, that are in the public domain. They're materials that you could get anywhere. And yet, we have not yet gone to digital case books. How is that possible, given the enormous cost? If you're in law school, you're taking a handful of classes, $150 each for these books, almost no uptake for the digital books. I think it is the interface is no better, the annotation is terrible, and so forth. And it just seems to me that's a fairly obvious thing. But let's just imagine for a second that we all trend towards, at least for some of our usage, toward preferring a digital format that's actually excellent and can be accessed through an Android phone or otherwise very easily. One of the problems is that publishers have not been willing, traditionally, to allow libraries to lend on the same basis that they have in the past. Many of the publishers have said no, even with our most popular books, we won't lend them at all to libraries or license them to libraries to allow them to lend. But if you think about it even more fundamentally, even if the publishers do allow libraries to do that, what's happened is that there's been a fundamental change in what libraries are actually doing, which is in the current age, they buy a physical book like this, and they put it on the shelf, and they have it accessible. And if you are living in Arlington or Watertown, and your library doesn't have it, they can call up Cambridge, and Cambridge can send it along with interlibrary loan, and so forth. In the digital era, that isn't necessarily true. And by and large, the contracts that libraries are getting do not allow them, ultimately, to own the book in any physical way. They're just leasing or loaning them. If the publisher goes out of business, that's one problem. If the library stops paying the license, that's another problem. But fundamentally, libraries do not then own their collections in the digital world. And that has as much to do with contract as it does with the background copyright law. But the notion is that librarians are fearful that they will not be able to fulfill the function they have fulfilled in democracies in a digital era as they have in the analog era, which itself is just a perverse outcome, right? We should have more access to knowledge and information, not less. And yet the way in which it is playing out doesn't make that likely. So I think at this moment where we stand is we have a moment where we're going to build the future. We'll build the future of libraries and of knowledge and information in a way that's akin to building the great public libraries from 150 years ago or so. This is a view of the Boston Public Library as it was being built. And I think we're at a similar moment when it comes to thinking about the hybrid of digital and analog libraries. I think we are at a design moment where it's crucial that we figure out what we actually want this information or this knowledge commons to look like, and that we actually do it in the way that we have in the past, which is if you were imagining building a new building, and this is a side elevation of the building I worked in at Harvard Law School, you would in fact bring together architects, presumably with the teachers and librarians and maybe some of the students who you're trying to consult and build the space for, and you would do a process. Maybe it's a design charrette, but you would come up with an idea. What should the classrooms look like? What should the library reading rooms look like, and so forth. And I feel like that's the moment that we have right now in libraries, is to do that for a digital era, to bring together people like all of you who work in the information space, information architects, along with physical architects, and to figure out what does this hybrid environment look like going forward, and how can we make sure that it has all of the excitement and innovation of the information economy while also having a preservation for knowledge in the long run, and also those democratic ideals of access, of being free to all. And I think it's entirely possible to do that. The case that I make in this book is that one of the things we should do, in addition to supporting traditional libraries, is actually work together to create a digital public library system. That just as we did 150 years ago, create a system funded by Mr. Carnegie and others of little libraries all around the world, the United States being one part of it, but the same notion has spread globally. We should be building digital libraries at the same time. I understand, of course, that many of the early efforts in this space happened right here for Google and Google Books. Did anybody work on Google Books or does? Awesome, so we have some veterans or current members of the team. The inspiration of the Google Books project led a bunch of people to come into a room in Harvard about 4 years ago to seek to do something complementary, which was to create actually a digital public library system for the country to take advantage of the ability to digitize enormous amounts of works and make them available in a broad way. And that actually has been going for the last several years. It started with a single sentence that was agreed to by a series of law professors to begin with, but also librarians and information architects and some foundation presidents. And the idea was to create an open and distributed network of online resources drawn from all over the country in order to create the backbone, the platform for a digital library system for the future. And amazingly enough, we have been working on doing that, and it is a part of the argument I want to make for the future of libraries. So one way to think about this actually is to step back and say, what actually is a library in a digital age? What is essential about it? What are the pieces of it? And I think that they are slightly different than they were in the analog age. If you start with the idea of code, I actually think libraries are, in fact, in a digital space, about code. It is my strong preference that that code be open source code and made available very broadly. So one of the efforts in creating a digital public library, I think, is the creation of a GitHub for libraries, the notion of creating a huge amount of code that anybody can take and reuse in a variety of ways. We started by offering to the world the chance to code anything you wanted and to put it into a common environment. This was called a beta sprint, and it actually attracted about 50 people who came forward to build what they thought a digital public library ought to look like. We required, amazingly, that they retain no intellectual property rights, that they agree to give those rights to the public domain, and that they get no compensation for it. And the sort of amazing thing was that people stepped up and wanted to do this, I think, because there's a huge reservoir of interest in creating a digital future for libraries. So as we have built the digital public library, it has come with a series of releases and ultimately been, I think, a technical project to start. Second, libraries are about metadata. They are about the data that describe where the data are. So if you think about a book as a bunch of data, you have a huge amount of metadata about it. Don't have to make that case here in this room, but it is an essential piece of what libraries hold. So a catalog record would be an example of that. Circulation records, who was it who wanted that material, what its subject headings are, and so forth. And secondly, if you think about what a library needs to have, it needs to have this huge store of metadata. libraries spend a huge amount of time and money creating often duplicative versions of metadata. And often they also worry about the intellectual property claims of this, that maybe there are copyright interests in the metadata. I would submit that there actually aren't good copyright claims for most forms of metadata. And in fact, that if libraries were much more collaborative in terms of sharing their metadata, that there would be many, many fewer forms of duplicative effort. And that ultimately part of this digital library system is a huge store of metadata. There's something called Library Cloud, which is one experiment in this way, and the DPLA is a part of that.
So isn't OCLC supposed to do that?
I think OCLC should do that, and should do that in a kind of a more open way. And there are lots of ways in which if those who are holding information in a fairly proprietary fashion would in fact share it more broadly, that we would, I think, reduce a lot of duplicative effort. So yes, I think if OCLC were in essence to create all of its information on an open access basis, we would be better off. And individual institutions have been saying back to OCLC, which is a great collaborative and a very important thing, if you were to allow us to do this, we would be able, I think, to have something that a huge amount of innovation could be done on top of. And I think that's actually starting to happen. Third, the digital library is about content, of course, and I think one of the big efforts is to do what Google Books has done, but to do it in a highly distributed way, which is, in fact, to digitize as much as we can that is enormously useful. Of course, there are intellectual property topics that arise in this context, as you well know, but I actually think there's much more that we could be doing than we are. So the third part of what a digital library could be is, in fact, the objects themselves, and to figure out how to harness all the digitization that is happening all around the world. Fourth, I think libraries are in fact about tools and services. They're about ways of getting information to people who wish to use them and to engage with them. And very often libraries are creating the same thing over and over again. You might think about each library creating a separate Android app rather than having a series of open code that they could use and reuse in a simple format. Another example is the idea that we have been working with about having a Scan-a-Bago. The idea that librarians could get a Winnebago and put a scanner in the back and have maybe a retired librarian or a library student drive the Winnebago around a community, go into places like historical societies and to digitize materials and to share them more broadly with the world. This is an idea that has lots of antecedents. So in Massachusetts, there's something called the Digital Commonwealth, an effort that allows all of the 351 cities and towns to digitize their materials at the Boston Public Library. And you can imagine the distributed network that is possible if you were, in a sense, to be spreading out across the country and digitizing materials and bringing them together into a common place. And last, I think libraries are fundamentally about human beings, that they are about the librarians, they are about the people who are the interface between the library users and the information. And even though this is something, of course, that Google does extremely well in the search business, we also know, particularly from studying people's search patterns, that it is crucial that you have humans who can be an interface between a kid and information. I'm teaching a course in United States history at the high school I work at, and this is the third year. You guys probably took History 300, and at the end of it you write a very long paper. If students relied only upon what they could find on the web, I can guarantee you that it would be a much less good paper, in fact, than the ones that are done when human librarians are part of that interface. And I think that that may be something that over time could be conquered through algorithms, but no time soon. And it's quite clear that librarians as human guides within the information environment, often digitally, but in addition to the analog, are crucial. So that, I think, is the fifth element of what a library needs to be. So one way to think about it in more technical terms is to think of libraries not so much as standalone institutions that are collecting information often in a competitive way. In other words, trying to collect the same information into each of these different physical spaces, is to think instead of libraries as platforms that enable people to do things with information and with knowledge. So the design that we've created for this digital public library is, in fact, to create exactly that. So in very simple form, it's really a collection of metadata about objects that are around the world that have been curated in various ways related to America. that's in this metadata repository. There's a mechanism for ingesting it. So the notion is that there are many different contributors of information into this particular platform. And on top of it is an open API, a crucial part of the design. And on the far end is a mode of export that says if anybody wants to take all of this code, all of this metadata, anything that we've created, and create a better one, you can do that. The notion that if somebody wanted to create something that would take literally all of this effort and make a competitor that is vastly more effective, I actually think that would be a huge success if it were to happen. Fundamentally, I think that we will create in this digital era things that we can't imagine today. But there also is a need, I think, for a way to access information that is in all of the libraries that are collected. So the Digital Public Library has a front end. It's at dp.la if you want to go to it. It is a reasonably simple interface. I think it works okay in terms of presenting information. But most important, I think, it directs you to the various applications and the other ways in which people have thought about creating access to the same store of information. And I would love to see libraries across the country and archives and museums taking the same information and curating it for their local communities. A very different way to think about their job, which is to go into an enormous store of information that's been curated at a national level, but then think about how it's made available directly to individuals in a local environment. Another piece of building it out is thinking about the sources. How do you get the information into such a platform? And I think this is in part why the system can be so effectively distributed broadly. The notion is to create a series of different hubs that are digitizing materials and then sharing them with others through the on-ramp that is the Digital Public Library of America. There are a couple different types of hubs. One is being called a service hub. That really is often a state. So in Massachusetts, it's the Digital Commonwealth. So at the Boston Public Library are a handful of people who work very effectively at digitizing materials and then ensuring that they are available locally and then shared globally. And there are a series of different states that have it. There are also content hubs. These are places that have digitized a huge amount of information. So an example would be Harvard University down the street, or New York Public Library, which has contributed about 1 million objects to it. Google Books could be a great example. We would love to have contributions from that project in the DPLA. But the notion is that you have large stores of information that have been digitized at big institutions, and then you have states that create places for individuals to share the information up into this library. Roughly speaking, as of today, these are places that have already contributed into this national store of information. It is about 1/3 of the country, and the effort right now over the next couple of years is to complete the map, to ensure that every part of the country has a way to contribute this information into the digital store that will be available. And then, of course, the value of it, the power of it becomes much, much greater. So if you look on the map, you can see the ones that are sort of orangish red are the service hubs up and running. There are a bunch in development, and the yellow dots are representative of big institutions that are contributing information from libraries, from archives, and from museums. And again, we would be very happy to have private sector partners in that effort. In a slightly more technical mode, this is the notion of the platform itself. I would say that one piece that we have not focused on as well as we might, and where should Google engineers wish to be helpful or designers, is really on the user interface side. Again, anybody could take the information and could create an application that would make it more useful to others. The notion of the platform is that libraries ultimately should be in this business, should be focused on making information more useful to users. One of my great fears about libraries becoming obsolete, in a sense, is if, in fact, the interfaces are ones that never have libraries in the first set of search results. So if you think about the patterns that graduate students or the students who are trying to access information go through, they almost always start with you guys, with Google, and they will look in the search results, and they will often click on, for instance, Wikipedia as one of the early entrants. They might click on Amazon and find a work there. They might click on a recommendation from Amazon. But I actually think libraries have often found themselves out of that particular mix. And I feel like as information moves increasingly to the cloud, librarians actually need to be in that research and development space. They need to be creating applications that ensure that in that search process, libraries are a part of the relevant search results. And I think if the emphasis were in part on developing applications that were useful in that process, I think that could happen. And hopefully through this design, it might. One particular example of the kinds of things that libraries have developed, this is a version called StackView. It was created at the Harvard Law School library through a group called the Library Innovation Lab. And the idea went this way. It was to think about the process of browsing in the stacks. If you think about the thing that people usually tell you that they love about libraries, it's that experience of getting a call number and then walking into some stacks and trying to find a book, and then you see the book there, but you actually see other books that you want around it, because that's part of the fun of libraries, and you come out with a huge number of books in your arms from the stacks, many more books often than you can carry. And the fear is that if what happens in the digital age is that you simply search for something and you find exactly what you want in a pinpoint way, that you might lose that form of serendipity. You may have heard the same critique about the newspaper moving from the physical newspaper to the online space, that if you're reading the New York Times in the morning, you often see an article that you didn't think you needed off to the right. I'm sure you think about this a lot in the context of presenting material in Google. But it seemed to me another way to see this is to flip it around and say, as much as we can worry about the loss of serendipity and the loss of stacks, and to be very clear, I think stacks are a great thing and a very important part of the interface in libraries, and we ought to have them. I actually think it's possible that in a digital age we could do better than we do in the physical space. So I'll give you one example. The Harvard libraries, which are in effect down the street, or you could think about the MIT libraries closer by, actually don't have a single stack where you can find all the information. In the context of Harvard, there are 73 different libraries. And in fact, there's a library depository that's 20 miles away. And the notion that anybody could actually look at a stack of things and see where all of the books are is implausible for most library systems. Think about how could we combine the MIT library system and the Harvard library system, or think about Metro New York, how many different libraries there are. But digitally, of course, we can do that, and we could do that, in fact, much better. And the idea here of StackView is to say, what if you combined entire collections and then had basically an infinite stack that you could go through? You could imagine paging along in your Android device and seeing this infinite stack presented. And then if you can imagine also using all that metadata that we've created and made accessible to use other ways to surface things that might be interesting. So in this particular example, somebody has come along and has searched for gravity's rainbow. And what they see is, of course, the gravity's rainbow they went for. But they've also got a whole bunch of data that's been, I think, well anonymized at this point from 2009 in a circulation heat map. And the idea is to say who, in fact, has been accessing these works based upon some of their demographics, and which works have been read the most. You can imagine in the context of searching for, say, the Iliad, which version of a whole bunch of editions of the Iliad should you access? And if you are a student who wants to know how many times a professor has taken that particular translation or that particular forward, you could use the metadata to figure out which example you wanted to take. I use this just as one example to say, I think that in the future we have so many different ways that we could improve upon the information and knowledge architecture that we've created, but only if we create this platform, and only if we engage libraries as well as individuals in doing that. Another thing that happens if we think about libraries in this highly collaborative way is also that we surface huge amounts of really interesting information that has been curated very locally and not actually yet digitized, not yet accessible from a Google search because it hasn't yet been put onto the grid. And in a very short while, these are a few of the things that have been digitized as part of this effort to create the national on-ramp and to add them into what a library is. And many of the things are regional, so tiny little examples, for instance, of Appalachian culture, but also things that are broadly of interest, by and large things around the war, Civil War, World War I, World War II. These are things that have enormous appeal. Genealogy would be another example. Ultimately, I think we are at a very early stage of developing what digital libraries will be. And importantly, they need to be combined with the physical library infrastructure that we have. And I think that's part of what's exciting, is to say, how do we actually think about the problems that need solving in communities? How do we then combine what we can do incredibly well in the digital environment with what libraries do so crucially in the physical world, and put them together as we are building this future? I often think about the most beautiful of the library spaces as we're imagining what we could build. This is the Adams Library nearby in Quincy. And the appeal of this, in some respects, is those beautiful reference books that are out on this table, and the idea that people would come to a physical space, who would come to find the nuggets of information that they have been missing. And I don't think, actually, that reference is something that's ever going to return to physical spaces like libraries. I think that's something that we can safely say has been conquered by Google and Wikipedia and others. So I doubt that people are going to come for these huge books that are encyclopedias to a particular space. But I do think the idea, the joy of actually coming to a physical space in a community to access information that we need for one reason or another is something that we could and should preserve. And trying to figure out what is something just as beautiful as this that actually would attract people to come together in a cultural setting, I think that is a huge part of the challenge of ensuring that libraries thrive in a digital era. I think it needs to be done in a global context. I actually think this is one of the huge upsides for libraries in a digital era, the notion that we actually can imagine connecting a lot of different things together. There's a guy named Siva Vaidyanathan who wrote a book called The Googleization of Everything, you may have read. And in the end of his book, Siva wrote about the notion that you could imagine a global digital library, something that connects the knowledge of the world in sort of the way that a digital library of Alexandria might. And in that book, I think he presents a really compelling vision. And it's something that I don't think has to happen in just a one-size-fits-all way. I think ultimately we can create this kind of future also by doing it locally, by drawing upon the distributed nature of the web and actually learning from the way in which the web was built in order to create this global vision. So I'm very excited about the notion that individually communities, and it could be communities at the state level, it could be communities at the national level, can create things and then make them interoperable. So as we've created this digital public library of America, part of our argument has been to say we don't have to have something exactly the same in every one of the 200 or so countries in the world, but rather just make them interoperate effectively. So the very first thing we did, even as it was just getting started, was to have an agreement with the European version called Europeana. And so through a memorandum of understanding, there is in fact a series of crosswalks that allow you as a user to go through the information that's in Europeana through to the things that are in the Digital Public Library of America. And the easy way to think about this is that you can curate exhibits in the digital way. So the first exhibit was to look at immigration between the old world and the new and vice versa, to imagine curating materials from both sides. So just as these little national digital libraries start popping up, I don't think the point is that we have to create one huge digital library of Alexandria. I just think we have to agree on a series of things, really dry things like metadata standards and licensing agreements and so forth. But I actually think by doing that, we can create something that's enormously powerful on a global level. Ultimately, I think it is not going to be a utopian future. I don't think there's the possibility that by just designing it well, we'll have something completely perfect. Copyright completely stands in the way of doing what I would want to do. So I acknowledge this huge elephant in the room. If we could have a more friendly copyright statute, that would be very, very helpful to creating something that would be approaching a utopian future for libraries. But we don't. So part of it would be advocacy. But I do actually think it's worth thinking in these very broad terms, thinking in utopian terms, thinking about what we want a library to be in a digital era. And I think by doing that, we will draw upon what's so essential about libraries in the physical era. We will create something that is, in effect, a very, very powerful hybrid. And I think it's something that can be done. Essentially, it needs to be done in a collaborative manner, though. I think this is one of the things that libraries have done well in the context of something like OCLC, which is used to be a collaboration within some libraries in Ohio, but is now a very important national collaboration. So libraries do it often in a very good way. Interlibrary loan would be another example. But I think too often still there's competition in between individual libraries, and there's often too much competition between the public and the private sector. And my argument would be the best approach would be one where we actually were doing this in collaboration, that a company like Google would work with libraries to do it rather than to have a standalone series of projects in the private sector and a standalone series of projects in the public sector. So I'm a big believer that this is something that actually could be good for the public in a broad way if we were to embrace a series of common principles. And I would say, just by way of closing, that I actually think that this is a project that is enormously important to the success of our democracy. And this may seem like an overstatement, but I think that if we were to lose physical libraries, or we were to lose the possibility of creating a series of digital interfaces and objects and really an innovative future that lies ahead of us, that we will be much poorer than we would be otherwise. And I think if we get it right, we can be much the richer. I think it could be a very powerful aspect of democracy moving forward if we get this platform right, and if we in fact get the design, in essence, of digital libraries going forward. And I actually think it will not undercut local libraries. I think it will drive people back into physical libraries and be a very powerful force for good. Thank you so much. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm a great lover. Is this working? I'm a great lover of libraries.
Excellent.
The Academy Library at Exeter, fantastic building.
It's an amazing building.
Wendell, less interesting, but
Yeah.
lots of good stuff in there. Widener, I love looking at the stacks and so on. What worries me a little bit is that your talk seems to be based on existing ways that libraries work. So the notion of the book as the unit, the notion of metadata rather than contents being shared. So metadata is wonderful. I use it a lot. The notion of metadata is, I mean, if you look at library rules, they say you're not allowed to have more than whatever the number is, 5 library cards per book. So you have an author card, a title card, and 3 subject cards, which is absurd, right? We don't need that kind of restriction anymore. But on the other hand, the economics of libraries depend on some of these characteristics too. Like you have to buy a physical book, and first sale doctrine says once you buy it, you can do whatever you want with it, right? But now, if you can distribute it instantaneously anywhere in the world, that model no longer works economically. Who's going to pay for the author, the publisher? So the economics seem to be missing from your proposal. How is this actually going to fit into the publishing ecosystem? I think I should stop there. I have lots of stuff because I'm fascinated by this topic, but I'll stop there.
That's so good. Well, I'm imagining from the nature of your questions that we agree quite violently in terms of where we need to go. And I don't promise in any way to have all of the aspects of a huge proposal for the future of libraries figured out. And in fact, that's sort of essential to this story, is to say one of the things I don't want to do is just foreclose what might be possible. I haven't figured out what the right interfaces are going to be. I haven't figured out what the right business models are going to be. But I do think that if we create something that allows people to build together, I think that that's something that will result in really great experimentation. So when you talk about metadata, I couldn't agree more. I think the series of rules that constrain what counts as metadata is a really a potentially destructive thing. I think the fact that there's so much more in the form of metadata, maybe I'm using a word that itself is too restricted, so you might help me there, restrains libraries from doing some of the things that they could in terms of making the knowledge much more accessible. You talk about content being restricted to the codex. I don't think so at all. I do think that is a fear for libraries, is that by focusing only on one or a series of particular formats, that's constraining. So I think when I'm talking about content, maybe again I need a better word, but the point is I think we should break down the units and change the units enormously. I just don't think libraries themselves as institutions are very very involved in that particular game. So the vast majority of people who work in libraries are focused on acquiring things that look like this and bringing them to a physical space and helping people find them. When I was working at the Harvard Law School library, I had an early conversation where we looked at what everybody was doing out of the 100 or so people who were there, who were awesome. And when you looked at all of their job descriptions, more or less 99.5 of the 100 were focused on something that related to the physical object, right? And there was really 0.5 of somebody who was focused on the web interface and the digital interface through which lots of people were coming. And then I went and talked to a lot of the students who were involved and the faculty members, and it looked like about 50% of the time they were walking through the physical front door and doing something with objects, and about 50% of the time they were coming through that web interface, our digital front door. We're completely misaligned, I think, in that way. And I think libraries need to be more engaged in that, basically that redesign of what that interface looks like. And your last point about the business models, figuring out something with publishers for ebooks and everything that will come after, I think is an essential part of it. So most recently, the Digital Public Library, along with President Obama and New York Public and a whole pile of publishers, came to an agreement to distribute children's books as a starting point, a way to think about this. I agree with you that there are a series of different business models that would be very helpful, alternative compensation mechanisms for authors and publishers that could ensure the publishers still get adequately paid, but ultimately without needing all of those warehouses and all that printing time and all those things that happen. I actually think there might be another model that will work very well and will compensate authors fairly for what they've created. So I think there's a huge amount of opportunity exactly in what you're saying, which is break down a bunch of these units and then rebuild it in an interesting way. I guess what I am fundamentally saying is let's do so in a way that actually preserves a public option and has a really good role for libraries, because I think that's going to persist.
Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. An awesome multi-part, impossible to answer question, but just great.
That was only the 10%.
I bet.
Hi. So I've seen a trend with libraries locking away their rarest works. For example, Harvard has the original manuscripts of Emily Dickinson, and you can't get at them. The only format that they're available in is a format that's been edited, and they say, well, this has established a new copyright, so even though the originals are in the public domain, the edited version isn't. This seems harmful to getting things in the hands of the public and disseminating information. How do we show them that there's an error in their way, or are they actually right and they should be locking away these rarest of rare works?
Well, I don't think anything should be locked away that is, useful in sort of public discourse. So I can't imagine a version in which I would say it's right to lock it away. I think it should be digitized and made available in a whole variety of ways that are useful to humanity and to the furthering of scholarship. So absolutely at that level. The Emily Dickinson Archive is a very interesting example because, as you probably know, the works are held in multiple institutions. So Amherst has a bunch, and Harvard has a bunch, and so forth. And they are actually one of the things that has been digitized in part and shared through this particular system, the Digital Public Library of America system. I agree with you. I think it actually is inappropriate and crass to assert a new copyright in works associated with a great 19th century author. I think there's no value in doing that. I think that the institutions like Harvard and others who hold these materials in trust do so in the public interest and therefore ought to make them freely available. I think there is an advocacy role. I think librarians themselves have been fantastic advocates on things like copyright and on privacy. And actually, as a law professor working in that area, I would often be going to a conference or an event or something, and the librarians were the first people at the beginning of the line making these great arguments. I can't imagine what the downside is. I think sometimes the argument that I hear is that we have these unique materials, and someday there will be a future business model that will allow us to, wrest a little bit of profit out of it, and that will pay for all these other things. I don't, that future business model objection doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I've never really heard any other objection that makes any better sense. One thing that I think individually librarians and archivists sometimes worry about in museums too is if we digitize it, people will stop coming to the physical space. And I actually, as a library director, found exactly the opposite. When we digitize things, people wanted to come. They wanted to come and see the objects and touch them and so forth. And I actually think that's the better argument, is make these things available more broadly and encourage people to interact with them in ways that are really productive. And I actually think that if we did a large-scale empirical study, that's what would happen. And it's you think about it, you all work in the digital space. I think people get on airplanes more because they want to be face-to-face or drink beer or have a coffee with somebody when you meet them online. So I actually think that in both of those ways, those objections are false.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Actually, expanding on that last point you just made, you presented a very romantic view of a lot of library spaces in this
Yeah.
talk, and meanwhile talked a lot about digitizing a lot of these works. And I'm just wondering why libraries should continue as a physical space, what you think justifies that, as opposed to, as you just suggested, almost turning them into a museum where someone could come and interact with something they saw online.
That's a wonderful point. And I guess that's partly what I'm trying to say with this book, is I think both are valuable. That there is a value of having public, open, accessible third spaces that don't happen to be a Starbucks or a Mcdonald's or owned by a company. There's nothing wrong with Starbucks. I frequented it myself. But I do think that in communities, we need spaces where people come and are joined around ideas and knowledge. You could make an argument that libraries could just as well be, say, community centers. I don't make that argument. I actually think that if libraries were to become just community centers, you would miss something. So I think it's about the physical space. It is about the coming together. It's about the other humans who are there, whether they're the patrons or the librarians. But it's also about the ideas and the knowledge in an important way. And I think that Romanticism is really deeply connected to an act of democracy and an act of being a citizen. On the other side, I think if we let that argument say librarians have no role or libraries have no role in a digital era, I think that means we're going to lose those physical spaces. Why? Just because of the number of times, and you probably had this discussion, in communities when you're trying to decide whether money goes to fire or to police or to schools or to administrators or any of the other things that are competing, if you don't make a good argument for libraries, and in fact people just say I can get what I want on Amazon or get what I want on Google, I think we will lose those essential spaces. I think, though, if we allow nostalgia to be the driver, in other words, that memory of what a library was, I think that will erode over time. I think the idea has to be something that creates new nostalgia. It creates new ideas and new excitement around what a library can be that then will be the basis on which we will continue to reinforce this very powerful public option. So anyway, I think it's a great point.
I have a multi-part
Awesome.
question.
No surprise at Google Cambridge.
Well, also, I've been working on Google Books
Oh, of course.
Google Book Search for over 7 years now.
Wow, thank you.
My
That's exciting.
wife worked in acquisitions at the Harvard Business School library
wow.
before we met, and my father was a printer. So,
Oh my gosh.
my mother was a bookseller. So
You have the
lots of
entire
sides.
industry covered.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Metadata, I applaud your drive there. This is mostly just a comment. I didn't work on metadata directly, as Francis did, but the metadata availability is a mess, and I'm all for it getting homogenized. I'm glad there's an open project like this to do it.
Why do you think it's a mess? I agree. I'm just curious.
We have a bookstore. Google Play Books is now what it's called.
Yep.
We discovered that The Great Gatsby showed up as a computer book.
Mm-hmm.
And we dug into the metadata. OCLC, I think, is where that came from. Amazon also showed it like that. But because people weren't buying it as a computer book,
No, probably not.
that bit of metadata was so buried down that no one ever found it on Amazon that way. But it showed up when we put a shelf of computer books up. And when this happens, when a book like The Great Gatsby has the genre computer programming or whatever it was associated with it, you know there's a problem. It's hard to correct. You're going through a central organization that then tries to get the original provider of the data to fix it. So much of the data comes from things scribbled on cards that were later typed in by low-wage workers. I heard a story, I will not name individuals involved, where someone working in a library came across a second barcode associated with the book and thought, oh, this must be a mistake, and was deleting them, and it turned out they were essential information. It was just assumed by this hourly worker to be irrelevant, a mistake, and deleted. And with the pencil scratch, the pen markings on the paper card catalog cards, you can imagine all sorts of transcription errors by somebody who isn't a librarian and doesn't understand, and even some from the librarians. So getting the metadata such that it isn't swimming upstream for any organization to try to keep it ordered. Recovering from metadata that is, here is an item on the shelf that has a card, and instead, here is an entity described on the card that may be half a dozen different editions on the shelves, some of which are in multi-book bound volumes, and some of which are individual. The clustering problem, we've been spending years on it, and it is still very much an ongoing battle.
Fascinating,
And
thank
it's
you.
a problem that needs to be solved so that we can wrap our culture around these books and find the ones that people are looking for when they go looking. Librarians. One of the auxiliary uses of librarians is you walk into a library and you ask, how do I find out what buses run downtown? And a librarian, being a general knowledge assistant, you might say, can say either we have something in the library about that, or here's a phone number I believe if you called you'd find out. A lot of people who need the information the most are the ones who are isolated from information. Maybe you're at home, like, was Matilda the name, with the family that just watched TV and didn't read books, and you don't have a good place to ask general questions. Google and Bing and things like that, you can get some answers that way, but to get a human-interpreted question answered is very difficult. Librarians in particular, I see moving into a realm of general information assistance with certain information resources stored there where they're available, and other ones they can point you at through the computers. Computers, I think, have become part of libraries only because it's a convenient place to put a town-wide accessible resource. So that's how I think libraries might go. Do you, librarians in particular, and the spaces might go? Do you have any comment on that?
I think there is a plausible future that you're describing is adjusting the role of the reference librarian. Of course, one of the subsets of people who work in libraries. And I think one part where I would strongly agree is that libraries exist for all of us, but they are most important for a subset of people in our society. And at least in the context of big urban environments, it is enormously essential as places for people who are seeking jobs, people who are new immigrants to the country, people who are learning to read in a variety of ways. Very often, in fact, in most libraries, the largest users are young people. They are kids who are coming out of school. They actually don't have a great place to go in the afternoon. They go to a library for several hours, and they have a series of basic needs, some of which relate to doing their homework. And sometimes that free Wi-Fi is the only good free Wi-Fi they can get to complete their homework. And sometimes it is that there is someone there, an adult, who is in their life and can be a mentor for them. So I actually think one of the key reasons for defending library budgets is to say that for a lot of purposes that are fairly broadly written, actually don't have anything to do with anything that looks like this, that's an essential part in our society. And is that a policeman? Not quite, right? Is it someone who works in fire, someone who works in town hall? No, there is some value to people whose role in the community is to help people access the information that they need to be effective citizens, or to be thriving or joyful in their society. And so that's a slightly broader version of what you're suggesting, but I think ultimately that's right. And I don't think it can only be provided at a distance through a digital interface. Now, could you imagine a group of librarians, maybe people who have retired from librarianship, spending time being general information reference people through digital interfaces for someone who is shut in? Absolutely. And I actually think if you get this overall interface right and this overall platform right, that could be a wonderful thing for people to do. And maybe it's a way for people ultimately to connect to one another if you're a retired librarian who actually isn't mobile anymore, but wants to participate in an active way. That's something that actually could be a very powerful thing for them to do. So it's a wonderful opening, I think, to think about what the role could look like.
And finally, since I don't see anyone else waiting for a question, the elephant in the room.
Yes.
Copyright, something that Google has done that we haven't had available to libraries, maybe it hasn't come up in the thinking so much, is when a publisher has a book, if the government says you have to make it available to everyone, electronically, you can't keep it locked down as long as they're only looking at one page every 10 seconds or whatever. The publishers are going to, of course, be up in arms. It's very hard to convince something like that to go through, and they could potentially lose a lot of the profit that motivates them to publish these books. And if it's not available, if it's only metadata, then we lose a lot of the value of libraries potentially. Google does like 10%, 20% preview.
Yes.
Is that the sort of thing that, now that technology enables it, you folks are considering as a way to advocate for greater book availability.
Sure. I mean, is that a good thing? It absolutely is. And can we find the version of fair use that is maximally able to make books more accessible? Totally. I'm completely in favor of it.
Just to clarify,
Yes.
that is not our view of fair use or implementation of
Yes.
fair use. That is our implementation of, we put a clause in the contract with the rights owner
Absolutely.
that would allow us to do that.
Thank you. This is recorded and put on YouTube, and you have your own legal interpretation. My legal interpretation is you can do that under fair use, and it's great that you have that nice contract clause. Increasingly, I think we ought to try things that do press what the boundaries of fair use are in a positive way. And I ultimately think that there are ways that that authors like myself and publishers who publish these books will get amply compensated in this digital environment. I think that there's going to be a huge amount of experimentation with business models, going to that first question, and a little bit of that is happening now, and I think more will happen over time. I think very specifically, to get slightly geeky on copyright law, I think Section 108 ought to be amended, which is the special set of things that allow libraries to make things available. I think there are ways to think about it quite differently also for disabled people. It's a very important element of things. I think adjusting the orphan works rule would be the obvious and sort of almost stupidest rule out there, in the sense that if somebody has a work where you don't actually know who the copyright holder is, the fact that the default is that we can't actually digitize it and make it available in order to let that person come to the fore. I mean, it's just sort of amazing that who benefits from not changing the orphan works rules? Nobody. Anyway, so I think there are a whole pile of things that we could do that are really blindingly obvious and helpful. Thank you. Is it okay to take one more, Brendan? Yeah. One more. Yes, ma'am.
Hi.
Hi.
I was just curious if you have comments on the population of people who are librarians, and whether the ones we have now have the right kinds of skills and interests to help build this thing, whether the librarian education now is teaching the right sort of stuff, and like, are the people coming through that now interested in having the same kinds of roles as current librarians have?
It's a great question, and it's an important one ultimately. And I think for those who wring their hands about the future of libraries, often the critique is saying we have an aging population of librarians who actually don't really think about the future, and our library schools are not training people for the things that we actually need to get done. And is there some argument there? Of course, there's an argument there. That's not my experience, though, having worked in libraries. And I think there is a very large pivot going on, and I think that pivot involves people who are incredibly devoted to ensuring the future of libraries, figuring out a role for librarians that does bring the digital into the environment. It doesn't throw away the good things that are being done. I think the hard part is honestly making trade-offs and saying we actually don't need to do that anymore, or that old rule about only 5 elements of metadata. In a world in which there's much more available, things have to go the way of the dodo bird and the horse and buggy and all the rest, and have to be replaced with things that are wonderful. So my concern is actually just the rate at which that shift is happening. And I think when people say, people aren't moving to digital books so much, they're still focused on physical books, and we still love libraries and whatever, I just fear that those are just too thin reeds to cling to, that the world is changing vastly more quickly than that. I actually think that many library schools are now called information schools or iSchools. Many of the faculty in those schools absolutely see what's going on, and I think that's only a good thing. But I think there's a huge amount to be done, which would take the excitement and the things that you all do in digital technology environments and bring that much more into libraries. And that's why I'm excited about things like the Digital Public Library of America effort, because I think it says all this stuff that built the web and the internet and so forth, those same principles, those same skills, those can make amazing things happen in the public interest. And lots of people are doing it, but lots of people are doing it in for-profits that actually do great things, but very few are actually doing it in the context, or too few are doing it in the context of R&D in libraries. And I think that's what I'd love to see more of a shift toward. But do I think that the people who are working in libraries are amazing and forward-looking? Absolutely. So, thank you so much for having me here at Google Cambridge. I'm very grateful.